People are joining us. Good afternoon in Brussels, good morning in the United States to all our guests today. My name is Alex Martin. I'm the head of GlobeSec Brussels office, and I'm pleased to welcome you all to this webinar, EU-China Dialogue, part of Europe in a New Decade series led by the Brussels office. It just happens that the EU-China topic is among the hottest conversations these days in Brussels, but also in Europe. And following the strategic meeting between the High Representative Borrell and Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi just the other day, and also in anticipation to the EU-China summit at the end of this month, the list of topics to be discussed between EU and China to be agreed upon or not continues to grow. From the recovery post-COVID-19 to market access to trade, technology, global security, human rights, disinformation, Hong Kong, and the increasingly bellicose rhetoric between the United States and China. And at a time when the level of insecurity globally is high and the balance of power between actors is shifting, threats are multiplying, we need to engage in honest conversations about what type of cooperation is needed, on what front, under what circumstances and conditions, to prevent further clashes or conflict or instability. And to forge a unified view on how this dialogue between EU and China should look like is probably the biggest challenge we currently face. But I leave this $1 million question to the panelists today that will be introduced momentarily. Before I hand over to my colleague Ryan McCarroll, GlobeSec Global Order and China Fellow, I want to tell you that we will be live streaming the conversation on Facebook and LinkedIn, and we are live tweeting under the hashtag GlobeSecGoesDigital. Please also send your questions under Q&A section here on Zoom. And now I would like to give the floor to Ryan to kick off the conversation. Ryan?
Great, thank you, Alex. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our panel discussion on EU-China Dialogue. My name is Ryan McCarroll. I am a Global Order Research Fellow at GlobeSec, and I will be moderating the session today. As my colleague Alex mentioned, this could not have come at a more opportune time as the EU and China continue ongoing negotiations and dialogue on a variety of vital issues, from climate change to trade and international security, amid a pandemic that has at times stressed these relations. The debate about the future of the EU's relationship with China is now very much underway. As the EU and China work together towards a more cooperative framework, including a bilateral investment treaty and EU-China summit, GlobeSec is very happy to provide an impartial platform like this one to debate what this framework should look like moving forward. Before we begin, I just want to say a special thank you to our esteemed panelists for agreeing to join us today for this important discussion. Together, they bring with them decades of experience as public servants and as experts in EU-China relations. We are truly honored to have you here today. I would also like to say a special thank you to GlobeSec's Brussels office for organizing this wonderful event. And I would like to say that if you're tuning in via Zoom or social media, please note that we will have plenty of time for questions and answers. But if you could please direct your question to a specific panelist or panelists, that will definitely help us in getting your question answered. Let me begin by introducing our panelists for today, starting with the Madame Secretary, State Secretary from the Ministry of Foreign and European Affairs of Slovakia, Ingrid Brockova, Alice Ekman, a senior analyst on Asia with the European Institute for Security Studies, Stephen Everts, senior advisor on security issues and Asia-Europe meeting from the European External Action Service, Teresa Fallon, director of the Center for Russia-Europe-Asia Studies, Maria Spiraki, member of the European Parliament, vice chair of the Delegation for Relations with the People's Republic of China, and Yinghong Zheng, director of European Studies, Shanghai Institute for International Studies. Each panelist will have between 3 to 4 minutes for opening remarks, beginning with the State Secretary, Ingrid Brockova. Ms. State Secretary, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm extremely pleased and delighted to be part of this discussion. First of all, let me thank GlobeSec for organizing this debate. It's very timely. This is really the topic, followed by very closely by international community. China has been center of our attention, and China has been the priority. So the events of the past few months have brought a new wild card element into our relations and introduced yet another layer of complexity and even irritancy when dealing with China. The lack of reciprocity has cast a long shadow over our economic cooperation with China, and transparency and disinformation has become a significant issue for many who have been asking questions about the ongoing COVID-19 pandemics. Corona crisis has yet again demonstrated the need to foster multilateralism, the rules-based international order, transparency, free and open societies, and human rights. Without joint and coherent position of the European Union, it is very challenging to achieve. The question is whether we should bring China closer to the European understanding of multilateralism, or whether we agree that China is not interested in multilateralism but in control it. High Representative recently identified trust, transparency, and reciprocity as the three key principles of our relations with China, and underlined that these should be underwritten by unity of all EU member states. We could not agree more with this assessment. This was actually one of the key messages or conclusions from the recent FAC discussion on EU-China relations, which was held on May 29. Discussion reconfirmed that although China is a cooperative partner in many areas, it became more assertive. It is our economic competitor when it comes to technological leadership, and even systemic rival, promoting alternative models of governance. Within the context of our relations with China, we can and should endeavor to lead by example, including the area of global economic recovery, sustainable development, and climate change. As we negotiate another EU-China strategic agenda for cooperation, so-called Agenda 2025, we must remain mindful of the lessons learned while implementing the 2020 strategic agenda. Our lesson learned is that we have relatively well-functioning structures for dialogue and cooperation. Where we start to differ more and more is our value-based approach and interest with Chinese ones. I'm talking about human rights, rule of law, transparency, disinformation. With regard to liberalization commitments of both sides, we support the conclusion of an ambitious EU-China investment agreement that should be aimed at eliminating discriminatory laws and practices uh, and provide an equal basis to the Chinese market. We support the strengthening of the intellectual property dialogue mechanism with the aim to combat counterfeiting and piracy of new innovative forms of financial cooperation and financial services to improve access to finance for enterprises, in particularly SMEs. In this regard, we support the enhancing cooperation in the area of e-commerce, especially in regulatory field. We are approaching a moment when the world's biggest economy, military, political power will not be a democratic country. We have to prepare ourselves for that situation. That is why, at the end of the day, we have to coordinate with the United States. Our US friends are mistaken if they think they can challenge against China alone without the European Union. Neither we nor the US can handle China alone. So this would be our introductory remarks. So I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, State Secretary. Maria Spiraki, if you could follow up, that would be wonderful. Thank you. You're on mute.
Unmute. Okay, now I think it's working. Well, once again, I would like to thank GlobSec for organizing this event due to the issue that we are now discussing, because it is of extremely important to discuss frankly and publicly as well. So I would like to start with the three terms that our Joseph Borrell, our High Representative, has already used. It is trust, transparency, and reciprocity. And I would like to say that the prerequisite on starting rebuilding our relationship with China, or building upon the existing relationship EU-China, is our European value, which, according to my opinion, it is the backbone of our identity. And I would like to say that we have to underline that whatever the issue between EU and China, we as Europeans should never compromise our EU value, our European value, meaning that we have to stick on respect for human dignity and human rights, freedom of expression, democracy, equality, and the rule of law. Having said that, I think that it is the time to start working on strategic response, to start drafting strategic response at EU level. At the same time, start addressing strategic issues with China at a global level. For me, there are two main elements that we have to focus on. The first one is the green transition, and how can we work together in order to fulfill our Paris Agreement targets and to transform our economy into a greener one. And by the end of the 2050, for the EU especially, it will be a zero carbon economy. And the second one is how can we work together, how can we manage together the technological and industrial revolution that we are facing. We have four parameters at the table, and I think that these four parameters are in a way affecting the future dynamics between EU and China. The first one is the level of complementarity of the economies between EU and China. And I insist on the issue of the Green Deal and on the issue of the green transformation, because I think that the recovery package that we will vote for, I suppose by the end of July, before the end of July in our plenary, and the recovery package that the Chinese government and the Chinese economy is using could be finally used in order to transform the economies, could be finally used in order to reinforce research and innovation for accelerating the green transition. The second one is the so-called foreign direct investments. And this is, I think, one of the cases that we face in the EU, especially after the adoption of a pan-European screening mechanism for foreign direct investments. I think that we have to take into account the specific interest of every and each country, and maybe I can give you some further details on the issue of the privatization of the Piraeus port in Greece, because it is an important example. The third is the growing push that we face for European champions, which must become global players in industry and in terms of technological developments of 5G. And the fourth is the hostility towards the development of the 5G network by Huawei. So having said that, I would like to conclude by saying that in this period of time, in this period that we are now facing, not only the pandemic, but also the economical and social consequences of the pandemic, we take some lessons, and I think that it is important to stick on them. The first one is the importance of self-sufficient of every and each economy, and I mean that the self-sufficient of the European economy and the self-sufficient of the Chinese economy, and as well the complementarity of the global economy. And the second one is the fragility of interdependence of global supply chain and value chain. Thank you very much, and I'm at your disposal to answer to your questions.
Thank you very much, Maria. Teresa, would you like to follow up on that? You're also muted. If you could unmute your microphone, sorry.
Okay, hello everybody. I wish we could all be together in person. I'm honored to be invited to this event. And it's been quite a week, hasn't it, in regard to EU-China relations. So this morning I woke up and the first article I saw in my inbox was how in the South China Morning Post, how Xinhua had misrepresented what Joseph Borrell had said. And ironically, yesterday they had also published paper saying that they see China as a provider of disinformation. So these two things dovetailed. So you had the EU-China preparation meeting with Wang Yi, Foreign Minister Wang Yi, and Joseph Borrell, and then to have it misrepresented seemed to be quite ironic. So I wonder how things got so pear-shaped. So that's the question I have. And I was looking back in 2016, we saw the first time that the EU was really unable to speak with one voice on a specific issue in regard to the arbitral tribunal decision. So we saw a wedge strategy being used in Europe. So the Hungary and Greece were unable to support this. It was a watered down statement. So I think also 2016 was also the height of China's investment, FDI, in Europe. And after that, we've seen a decline year on year. So what does this mean? So 2016 was a peak of investments, but also the beginning of this kind of wedge strategy within Europe. In addition, prior to that, we had the 17+1. And here where I sit in Brussels, many look at this with great concern. Is this some sort of way to fragment Europe? And with now, if we fast forward to COVID-19 post-pandemic period, we're starting to see a fragmentation even within the EU. Initially, of course, Italy was disappointed with the European response. China seemed to be there with mask diplomacy. And there's, through the Corber recent public opinion poll, Italy is kind of more pro-China and has concerns about its neighbors, Germany and France. So this was kind of a negative outcome of what happened with COVID-19. So Europe is looking more, has more issues to encounter, but China kind of played up their mass diplomacy to the detriment of the EU narrative of solidarity. So instead of having a very positive agenda, as China has done in the past in Europe, they've actually, with COVID-19, they've kind of brought in a negative narrative. So we've seen, as the report highlighted yesterday that was published, disinformation. So we saw this initially in Italy, and we're seeing it across the board in Europe. So Europe is responding by calling this out. And so that's my first point. So my second point is the issue of last year. So we forget 2 years prior to that, EU, China, they were unable to have a signed statement at the end of their meeting. So last year was a special year. And I think that was because of the triangularization of what was happening with the US. So China didn't want to have bad relations also with the EU. So they were having trade issues with the US. And we saw how Europe was really in a good position, and they wanted that investment treaty deal, and that was supposed to be finalized this year, 2020. But we've seen now with the National People's Congress, the 2 sessions that took place last month, it wasn't even on the agenda. But it's not that, you know, the narrative they tell the Europeans is that, oh, we're so busy with COVID-19 and pandemic issues, but they had time to speak about how they could join RCEP, the Regional Cooperation Agreement for Asia, and also TPP. So they're kind of focusing more on their region. And this is part of the international situation where we're seeing growing regionalism. So Europe has been once again put on the back burner on this agreement, which the investment trade agreement, it started in 2013. So there has been no progress on that. And that was kind of the promise that was made last year. So I think there will be a great deal of disappointment in Europe on that. And my last point is, you know, we went from a period of convergence with China, the idea of trade with China and cooperation with China and people to people, but we're really now in a period of clear divergence. And the response of Europe is to improve their toolbox. So we see FDI, foreign direct investment screening mechanism, which will come into play in October of this year. But even since it was drafted, it's already had an effect. We've seen a steep decline in China's investments. And it's for it's multi-pronged reason, but people are aware, the media is aware, and everyone is much more cautious about investments and the economic coercion that that can lead to. Now, we saw what's happening in the UK, of course, sadly, no longer a member of the EU, but because they're smaller and nimbler, we see a great deal of effort on their part in their response to China. So they're trying to come up with a D10, these other countries that can work together, democracies, a D is for democracy, on how to come up with their own 5G technology to avoid Huawei. And so prior to this, the Boris Johnson administration had embraced Huawei, and there's been a complete rethink in the UK on Huawei. Now, I would say that the EU is unable to do that because with 27 member states, some have been, it's far more difficult for them to speak with one voice on China, as the former President of the Commission, Juncker, said last year. EU is unable to speak with one voice on China. So the big issue now would be the future of Huawei, and also where is Europe going to lie on this whole issue of cybersecurity? Now, yesterday or 2 days ago in the press meeting after the Wang Yi-Borrell meeting, Borrell said that China is not seen as a security threat. But then just down the road at NATO, you had Jens Stoltenberg having a meeting saying that China is coming to us in Europe. So it's in the Arctic, it's in the cybersphere, cyber war. And even the EU the following day printed a paper about information war, or disinformation war. So, or I should say disinformation, they don't use disinformation war, but many analysts see that as part of a toolbox on warfare. So it's very unclear where the EU stands, especially with this new administration. So I think that there has been a great deal of disappointment. We saw last year, systemic rival was introduced with the EU-China paper, and China, it took them about 3 days to respond because they weren't really sure what that meant. And I really get the impression that they want that removed. They don't like to have the European dialogue talk about them as a systemic rival. They would rather just talk about them as a partner, or a cooperative partner. So I think that's almost on their agenda to remove systemic rival, but it's there. And that came from the BDI, the German Federation of Industry. That came from a paper they published January 2019. So we saw that the problem for China is they lost the support of industry in Europe, but specifically in Germany. And so there has been this backlash, there has been this pushback. The requirements, the things that they've asked for, reciprocity, opening the markets in China, and having a fair playing field. Now, we don't seem to see any progress being made on that. And I think that these are things that the EU-China dialogue should really focus on.
Yeah,
and I look forward to your questions.
That's a great place to leave it. Thank you, Teresa. And Yinghong, would you like to come in on that?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you just fine.
Yes, my topic is about the new trend of the global industrial supply and the possibility of EU-China cooperation on supply chain. And I list the 4 major factors that will impact the global supply chain to represent. The first one is that in China, we call it the China will face the challenge of the premature deindustrialization process because of the rapid price rise in wage, estate, and the land, and the labor-intensive manufacture is shifting to the lower cost region, especially in the Southeast Asia. And the second element is the monopoly tendency of the giant companies, especially the giant companies on the field of the internet, artificial intelligence, and the cloud data processing. Because China and the US have its very huge single domestic market, and it is very easy to form a monopoly type giant companies, especially on the IT and internet platform. This is the main reason for EU to review its competition policy, and it's very difficult for decision makers. The third one is the destructive effect of the unilateralism and the protectionism in US. We know that the US has adopted the containment on China's company, especially the Huawei company, and this will, I think this will disrupt and destroy the global supply chain of the semiconductor and chips suppliers. The fourth one is the trend of the localization of the supply chain. We know that the United States and Germany and the EU Commission have adopted their new industry strategy to encourage the return of the manufacture and the reindustrialization strategy and the localization of their supply chain. This is the new trend. During the pandemic, we know that we have observed that Chinese experience have show that the whole supply chains in some sectors in China's domestic region is more resilient and competitive for Chinese companies. So this is the new tendency for more countries and more companies to maybe to pursue the localization and the industrial cluster domestically. And the possibility of the China-EU European country cooperation on supply chain, the pandemic has exposed the advantage and disadvantage of supply chain both in China and Europe. In China, we have observed that China is very short of its advanced technology equipments. Most of them are imported from the Europe countries. So China short of it's very difficult for China to cure the lives during the pandemic. And another hand is that the European countries have very depends on the medical supplies on the domestic individual medical protective supplies. So this is the reason I think China and EU can cooperate on the medical supply chain and the medical strategic stockpiles. And another shortcomings is about the logistical chain. In China, China has a shortage of its international logistical chain. I think in the German, it's DHL, the German company DHL is have very advantage on this sides. So I think China and the European company can have very huge potential on cooperation on the logistics cooperation. For example, the German Express, this is the railway transportation lines operated by Chinese company and the German company DHL. They have shortened to 10 days from Chinese city Shenzhen to German city Hamburg. In January, it will spend 20 days. So now they have shortened to 10 days. So it's very successful for both sides to cooperate. I say, I stop here. Thank you very much. Is my points.
Wonderful. Thank you for that, Yinghong, and thank you for bringing that perspective. Alice, would you like to go ahead and follow up on that?
Sure, Ryan. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you to GlobeSec. To complement my colleague's intervention, I would like to focus on methodology of dialogue, because actually this is a key strategic question. I think the key central question today in the current context is how can EU adopt a dialogue methodology that can promote more efficiently its interests vis-à-vis China. This question is certainly central because if you remember the general context, US under the Trump administration definitely considered that previous dialogue with China has not led to any substantial outcome, and therefore has opted to stop dialogue with China and instead adopt a tougher methodology that involves pressure and sanction vis-à-vis China. This was partly made on the basis, on the assumption of efficiency, how to be more efficient in promoting its interests vis-à-vis China. At the same time, as you remember, China has tried a rapprochement towards Europe. This was anterior to US-China trade tension, but this tension have accelerated China attempts to seduce, I would say, part of Europe and also institution to some extent in the context of accelerated trade and technological tension with the US and trying to play on transatlantic divergences. This rapprochement has clearly not materialized due to the diversity of divergences, but still China is trying to interact with the EU in this way, trying still to bet on a rapprochement in a tense geopolitical context. And in this context, the EU is still giving a chance to dialogue, but is certainly in search of a more efficient approach, and is trying to build a less naive, more realistic, I'm quoting here HRVP Borrell, more realistic type of relation. It's under building, and I think there is an important strategic brainstorming to develop here, because there is an urgent need to build a more efficient type of engagement. I'm talking about interest here in a realistic point of view. It's even more urgent because, as you know, and as some of my colleagues have mentioned, there exists a very deep trust deficit between Brussels and Beijing at the moment. I mean, this is my opinion and my analysis. I don't represent EU official position on this, but this trust deficit is obvious in my perspective based on 4 observations. First, misinformation related to COVID-19 crisis. Second, disinformation campaign issue in parallel with Russia activism. Third, propaganda or communication strategy around efficiency or inefficiency of political system, or the political system competition, political model competition. And fourth, trust deficit around the implementation of agreements. To what extent agreements that have been signed are actually implemented. So in this context, how do you promote a more efficient dialogue? This is a $1 billion question. I think there is, I mean, if we wish to engage in a realistic relationship with China, we have to acknowledge at least 4 things. First, it is unlikely that dialogue alone will make China change its domestic orientation or its foreign policy orientation and position. Why? Because under Xi Jinping, there is no doubt for there is no time for doubt or introspection. Clearly, Xi Jinping has been talking since 2016 about self-confidence, confidence in China's political system, in China's theories, including Marxism, in China's development path, and in China's culture. In this context, foreign forces, being European, American, or any, are not legitimate to shape, orientate, or channel China toward one direction or another. That's Beijing perspective, but I think it's important to remind. So dialogue on any sensitive issue, including, of course, Hong Kong, but also South China Sea, Xinjiang, and other domestic or regional flashpoints, are unlikely to be actual dialogue, but more exchange of position. Second, an arrangement to envisage a realistic dialogue with China. I think it's important to note that China will not change its diplomatic and communication methodology itself. Some of the speakers has mentioned the state media coverage of recent official remarks and following the meeting with Foreign Minister Wang Yi. This is not a surprise. It has happened before and it will happen after. So this is a constant. We know that the media landscape in China is different. We know that the methodology is different. I mean, this is a constant that has to be taken into account whenever a dialogue or a meeting is organized. Third, acknowledgement is important, in my opinion, to underline the contradiction that exists between China's economic policy orientation and EU's expectation in terms of market access. Clearly, there is emphasis now in China in building national champion, and the level of market opening up has been limited. And we could even, in a longer term, put into question China's path to reform, or at least put into question this path as we have seen it from Europe. You know that Xi Jinping said that China is still at the first stage of socialism, and the ideal of communism should still be the aim to head towards. I know this is the ideological, frame, but still it's important to take into consideration that maybe Deng Xiaoping's era of reform and opening up was limited in time, and that some elements remain, but others are more in favor of very state-led economy rather than a market economy. And I'm thinking about the reinforcement of party cells in diversity enterprises in China, for instance. And fourth, acknowledgement. I think we have to acknowledge that dialogue is a risky business in general term, especially when you have these 3 divergences mentioned before. Until when do you play the game until without risking to be trapped in this game? I think this is a central question for all the reasons mentioned, but also because of the significant asymmetry in terms of diplomatic capabilities. China is often able to prepare with a larger number of diplomats, very professional civil servants, the meetings and summits with the EU. And this also generates logistic preparatory question for the EU in very concrete terms. So for all these reasons, I would think that precondition and precautionary measures have to be taken before any dialogues with China, just for the interest of the EU. I would identify briefly, because time is short, 4 types of gaps that would need to be addressed to reinforce the efficiency of EU-China dialogue. First one, need to address the access gap. Clearly, access to leader in China is harder than the contrary for access to Chinese leaders to EU leaders. So the access gap has to be reduced to some extent to make it more level playing field. How do you do that? It's a matter of strategic brainstorming, but we have to address it. Second, information gap. There is more information about EU strategic orientation, ambitions, even functioning policy landscape than the contrary. And this also has to be addressed before the dialogue and during the dialogue, so that the dialogue can start and can be conducted in a reciprocal manner. Third, it's a point that is dear to me. I keep repeating it, but I will mention it here again, the definition gap. It's known that we are using more and more the same words, but mean very different things, from multilateralism to free trade to human rights. A diplomat friend of mine told me, well, you know, in diplomatic, in the area, in IR, it's been common to play on misunderstanding, just to sign a joint statement and agreement. But to what extent you accept misunderstanding? If you using the same word but talking about completely different things, maybe it's important to clarify what both sides means in concrete terms, just for the sake of efficiency. Because also misunderstanding can be used in strategic manner against your interest if you're not fully aware of this misunderstanding. And fourth, I would encourage to reduce the diplomatic capability gap that I was just mentioning before. There is a different way to do this. Of course, this is an issue to be handled internally, this is Europe's problem, not China's problem, clearly. But how to join forces as much as possible. I'm also thinking about joining forces and more cooperation and coordination among EU member state diplomatic capabilities, diplomatic corps to reduce.
That's probably a great point to move on to Stephen, because I think he can address that specifically as well within his remarks.
All right. Okay. So I conclude here. So I to leave the floor to Stephen, but all this to say that I would argue for a development of a more conditional dialogue, which also keeps other options open, depending on how this dialogue evolves. But in any case, I don't think this dialogue can continue in the same way and same methodology as it has been conducted before.
Excellent, thank you. Stephen, if you wanted to come in, that would be great.
Yeah, thanks very much, Ryan, and thanks to Globsec for inviting me. Great debate. A lot of ground has already been covered, so I'm gonna limit myself to 3 things and trying to respond already to some of the comments made by the colleagues, so we get in a dialogue under your leadership, Ryan. 3 things that I'd like to say in my 3 minutes. One thing on EU-China, one thing on EU-Asia, and one thing on doing our homework as EU. So that's the structure. So here goes. I go rapidly, because again, the State Secretary and other colleagues have already covered some of the similar ground. The first thing you gotta put in your head is when it comes to EU-China, there's not one single framework in which everything is gonna fit. China for us is 4 things at the same time. And I think people know it's a negotiating partner, it's a cooperation partner, it's a competitor, and it is also a systemic rival. It is all these things at the same time, and it's blending these 4 elements into a single coherent policy. That's the challenge. This is not easy. I'm not going to pretend that's easy, but that's exactly what we are engaged with. And the guiding, concepts that should guide us are indeed reciprocity, trust, and transparency, which should, I emphasize, should form the basis of EU-China cooperation. Not always the case that this is already in place today, but that should be the basis for our cooperation. That was, I think, the drift of what High Representative Borrell was talking about. I mean, unity among member states has been touched upon. This is fundamental. This is fundamental. Incidentally, China is not the only great power that sometimes likes to play on divergences among Europeans. This is perhaps also true for other great powers. But unless and until we are united as Europeans, we don't stand much of a chance. So that is the block on EU-China. Final comment, of course, the relative weight of these four elements that I mentioned earlier, this relative weight is changing. I think it's changing, and I think the competitive component of this is gathering greater weight, and this has manifested itself, I think, also through the corona crisis. That's the first point. Second point, EU-Asia overall. We've always said, and I have been working myself on this, if you want a solid EU-China strategy, you need a strategically rounded Asia strategy. So what has happened again in the last couple of years, and that is accelerating again, is the strengthening of EU relations with the rest of Asia. Sometimes people make the mistake, they reduce Asia to China. Big mistake. Asia is very big, very diverse. And so we strengthen cooperation with Japan, with South Korea, with India, with ASEAN, with Australia, New Zealand. I can give chapter and verse and details later on. But I think for the interest of time, I just want to put this out there, that is very much the backdrop against which also EU-China relations have been changing. If you change the context and diversify relations and enhance relations with the rest of democratic Asia, that changes a little bit also the context in which EU-China relations can develop. That's the second comment. The third comment, again, it came up here and there, and it's sometimes the prism through which we approach EU-China, but I would suggest that we need to do our own homework as European Union on many of these things, on investment screening, on procurement, on 5G, and I can give other examples, strategic stockpiling of essential products. All these things we need to do as EU for our own sake, for our own interest. The China challenge is a component of it, but it is essentially for me a question of doing our own homework. And then very, very final point, what is the sort of the EU-US part of all of this, because it tends also to figure prominently. Look, on many of these things that we find difficult with China's, some of China's behavior and the implementation gap that Alice mentioned, and on the substance, we are quite close to the United States. But it is also no secret that on some of the methods, we have difference on the WTO. There's quite a stark difference these days between the United States and the European Union's position. There are other examples on climate change, on what have you. So I think the whole set of challenges of an increasingly Asian century that we are entering will figure very, very prominently in the transatlantic discourse. But it's also true that for us, essentially, the upholding and the reforming of the multilateral system is the best way to address these challenges. Let me leave it here and looking forward to the debate under your leadership.
Great, thank you so much, Stephen. Okay, so we have quite a few different perspectives, several different topics that have been raised. I think in the interest of sort of trying to find some core themes that we can discuss, I identified about 4 different main themes from the opening remarks from most of the speakers. So one appeared to me to be a question of how effective diplomacy can be in an atmosphere of distrust, disinformation, and growing security concerns, including how to approach it methodologically. The second theme was the necessity of cooperating with China on economic and climate issues during a time of restructuring global value chains and increasing competition. And the third theme was the question of maintaining European values while cooperating with an increasingly authoritarian regime, and what the proper response should be to human rights concerns, for example. Finally, the fourth theme was this question of sort of great power competition and where the EU-US fit in the equation when developing a comprehensive foreign policy towards China. I know there were several other topics in there, but I think those 4 themes do a fairly good job summarizing all of the various positions that were identified in the initial remarks. With that, I would actually like to go back to the State Secretary and also Maria after the State Secretary about this question of maintaining European values while cooperating with an increasingly authoritarian regime. One thing that, of course, I think is on everybody's minds is the Hong Kong security law situation, for example, human rights abuses in Xinjiang. And these sorts of issues, I think, raise the question of how do you cooperate in this atmosphere. So, Madam State Secretary, perhaps we could begin with you and then Maria. I would just like to do two things before we start. One is to remind people in the audience that you are absolutely able to propose questions for the panelists. And the second is if we could please keep our remarks fairly brief given the time constraints. Okay, thank you very much. And Madam State Secretary, to you, please. I would just remind you to unmute your microphone.
Thank you very much. So yes, as we said, human rights aspects are very important for the cooperation and for the dialogue with China. Of course, with respecting the policy one country, two systems in terms of Hong Kong or Taiwan. And here I would emphasize that what should be guidance for all of us is the model of governance in this dialogue. That we know that this model is different in China, in the EU, or the view on this model. But what we should, what kind of inspiration we should have all is really to guide our dialogue and more to the convergence on model of the governance.
Great, thank you, Ingrid. And Maria, maybe you could follow up. And we also have a question from the audience, which is very similar to what we were just raising. So their question is that China is currently increasing its influence and control in Hong Kong, which is a direct breach, according to them, of the Sino-British Joint Declaration, which they view as a legally binding treaty. And the question is what can the EU do to be more assertive in defending its values and promoting them when negotiating and signing an investment agreement with China, taking into consideration the situation in Hong Kong? Oh, and Maria, if you could just unmute your microphone, that would be great as well. So we seem to be having some issues here with Maria getting the microphone.
I think it's
there
okay
it
now.
is.
I think it's okay now. Sometimes it happens. Well, I will maybe make a comment which will be very clear, and I strongly believe that we have to send a very strong and clear message to the Chinese government in terms of respecting the agreements and in terms of respecting the European values. And I mean that we have a lot of opportunities to escalate a kind of this approach by starting with sending them a clear message, and then we can escalate the wording and maybe start discussing on sanctions, because it is important for us to defend our values, and it is important for us to demonstrate to the whole world that we are together, not only as a common market, but also as countries, peoples, citizens of approximately 500 million, that we are sharing common values. And these values are our way to go ahead to the world. So I think that this is the message. You have to send a clear, a strong message to the Chinese government in terms of respecting the agreement in Hong Kong and in terms of respecting human rights as a whole approach.
Thank you. And Stephen, maybe I can bring you in here and ask you how this complicates efforts in other areas. So when we're negotiating things like trade agreements and what have you, how does the Hong Kong crisis and other human rights abuses sort of feature in these negotiations or distract from them, if you will?
Yeah, well, look, I think it's a matter of public record that we disagree on some of the ongoing dynamics in China with respect to human rights, where we see a tightening of the overall human rights situation and greater pressure on people who disagree. And I think the case of Xinjiang and now Hong Kong I think, point to that underlying trend. And I think we've set out clearly how we view the situation in Hong Kong as not in conformity with the one country, two systems approach. And I think we need to be very clear, as also the Maria from the European Parliament stated, we are guided in our foreign policy by our values, and we repeat these, say these clearly. Again, also at the case of the strategic dialogue, we have something called a human rights dialogue that has become, over the years, become an increasingly tense pattern of exchanges. But I think, the question of sanctions, I'm not sure if that is the most appropriate vehicle to do it. At the moment, there was only one country in Europe that was advocating that, and then famously, we need unanimity for everything we do on these cases. But so I think this is the space in which we operate. You can draw attention also to the fact that, say, the business environment and the reason why Hong Kong is such an important conduit for European investment into China could be jeopardized by some of the changes that are now being pushed through. These are some of the things that you can draw attention to, and maybe other colleagues can elaborate further, including our colleague from China herself.
Yeah, and with that, Yinghong, would you like to come in here and sort of give us your perspective on this issue in particular?
Okay, thank you for your question. And I think I want to say some points about the security law in Hong Kong. We know that in past, in general, China has adopted the one country, two system in Hong Kong. And in past, we focus on the two system too much, and maybe ignore the one country and how to set up the mechanism to protect, ensure the one country principle. In past, we ignore it. So recently, we have found some problem in Hong Kong, and especially maybe in the economic decline or some other economic problem happened in Hong Kong. Maybe it will accelerate the social crisis or ignite the problem in society field. So this reflect the governance. We have so-called the two system, the governance, domestic governance in the Hong Kong. So maybe Chinese government should compare, balance the two kinds of the one country, two systems. So maybe we should review our policy towards Hong Kong to maintain Hong Kong's peace and security and stability. And the security is more important for Hong Kong's economic development. First, we should revive or recover Hong Kong as an ordinary city. Then it will become a financial center in Asia or globally financial center. We have observed that the rise or crisis is very serious in Hong Kong last year, and the recent very dangerous for the ordinary people for their living. I think the ordinary life. So the first thing is to make the peace and revive the ordinary, the order for the ordinary people. So most ordinary people hope to revive the order. I think this is my point. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yinghong. And Teresa, I think on this point, I'd like to bring you in, and I'd like to bring you in on a couple of different points here. So one would be, maybe the perspective of the US as well, which I think has been, let's say, more aggressive in condemning some of the actions in Hong Kong. So I wouldn't mind bringing you in to comment on sort of the US versus the EU reactions, and also to sort of follow up on how you view the EU response so far and what you think, if it's appropriate or not, for example. And I just remind you to unmute your mic.
Okay, thank you for those questions. Yes, there's a huge difference in how the US approach Hong Kong and the EU. As Stephen pointed out, only one country of 27 EU member states even thought or mentioned sanctions, and that was Sweden. Sweden has a very interesting relationship right now with the People's Republic of China. But I think that that speaks volumes about China's influence across Europe, that 26 member states kept quiet about this. And in terms of negotiating strategy, it's not very wise, is it? I mean, it's always good to say we have all options are on the table, and then just let that hang over the negotiations. But to immediately declare that we will not use sanctions, well, you've just taken away your leverage. You've just, taken any sort of influence you have over the Chinese. So I think that that wasn't strategically or tactically a very good negotiating position, but maybe that speaks volumes about how this works. And you will not get unanimity. It's impossible. The EU cannot speak with one voice on China or anything related to China in regard to Hong Kong or Xinjiang or South China Sea or East China Sea. The list goes on and on and on. So to hope that the EU can do something, I'm sadly disabused of that idea. Since 2016, my view is that they've been effectively neutralized. We've seen statements on human rights because we heard how they're so interested in human rights. That was blocked by Greece. So the EU, which traditionally makes their statement in Geneva, was unable to do that. We've seen how Hungary blocked a statement on human rights lawyers in China. So Europe is pretty much sidelined, and they can talk about their values, but they're not doing anything with them. On the other hand, do I have to? I thought we were going to talk about EU-China, but the US is far firmer on this issue. Hong Kong is a complex subject, but I mean, there is a threat of sanctions. There's a threat of people who are involved in the business angle of this, or officials being individually sanctioned. So I think the US has come down much, much harder. But I think the EU tends to like to arbitrage the difference between the US-China tensions. They like to find a little space where they can benefit themselves. But I think at the end of the day, that doesn't really, they're no longer a lighthouse of values to the rest of the world.
Thank you for that. And with this, I think I'd like to go to Stephen. There's actually a question from the audience that I think also makes a nice transition here. And so the question is how do you balance these sorts of concerns with the economic reality that cooperation is good for Europe and for China, obviously? And their question is whether you think that the deterioration, or what they view as a deterioration of EU-China relations, will end up affecting Chinese companies operating in Europe, for example, barriers to the single market or tariffs and what have you. So how do you, to sort of rephrase, how would you balance these concerns with the economic motivations on both sides to cooperate? And also, do you think that the relations have deteriorated to such an extent that there might be actually some impact on Chinese companies operating in Europe?
Okay, well, my sense is that it's often portrayed as a sort of a trade-off. You either do human rights or you do profitable economic business. And I'm not sure if that frame is correct, because I think a lot of Chinese people do good business in Europe because it makes good business sense. And there have been quite a number of studies actually where people say that, countries that have perhaps been slightly more critical towards China have not been punished, quote unquote, by China in a prolonged basis. So I think that sometimes in the debate, these issues get sort of overplayed. So I think that with China, as indeed with other countries around the world, we will have to integrate these different components into an overall balanced policy. And I think that if certain deals make business sense, then China will go for it. So that is my answer to that.
Yeah, thank you. And actually, we have a follow-up question for the State Secretary, which is very much along these lines. And the question comes from a member of the audience who's asking that economically, for many countries in Central Europe, Taiwan is considered as a far more important investment partner compared to China. At the same time, Taiwan shares with Europe the values of liberal democracy. So his question is how do you see the future of relations of Slovakia and the EU with Taiwan in light of the increasingly assertive positions of China vis-a-vis Taiwan?
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you for that question. It is rightly pointed that we have quite intensive relations with Taiwan, but as many other countries in the region. I would say that we very much respect, or we cooperate in the framework of the EU relations with China, and also EU kind of framework with relations with Taiwan. The cooperation with Taiwan is focused mostly on economic cooperation. There is a lot of investment of Taiwan in Slovakia, but also in the cultural area and social area. But as I said, politically, we still very much respect the policy of one China, and everything is done in the framework of EU China policy.
Excellent, thank you. And Alice, I'd like to come to you because we spent some time now talking about some of the issues and areas of divergence, but the main theme of your initial comments and remarks was actually about how you get effective diplomacy to work, which I think is very important. As the State Secretary raised, there are clear areas where we need to cooperate with China, including climate and what have you. And in terms of these areas of cooperation, what do you think is the best way forward on sort of, I suppose, sometimes putting aside some of these areas that we disagree very strongly with China on in order to actually make diplomacy work?
This is a hard question because actually I think the list of divergences is longer than the point of convergences. So no, I was trying to find some hope in terms of European unity around the methodology, because as several of you mentioned, there is divergences on some of the key issues that are related to China. But on the methodology here, there is an area for convergence, but in a very specific aim towards efficiency and a dialogue with a goal, with a concrete aim that can be reasonable and that can also be, I would say, assessed in terms of figure, in terms of time frame, etc. Now, I'm thinking that the question of methodology is key, specifically because there is strong divergences. I mean, to be honest, since 2013, March 2013, over the last 7 years, the area of divergences, I mean, I would say in-depth divergences with the EU has been more numerous. I mean, I'm not talking about now EU member state levels. There has been some agreements, there has been some constructive dialogue, but overall, the path that China is taking from a political perspective, from an economic perspective, from a foreign policy perspective is very different from the path that the EU is taking and most EU member states are taking. So we are really entering a competition between political systems. China is actively a part of this competition, well before the trade and technological tension with Washington. So I think it's important to have this frame in mind, because as some of you mentioned, the issue of disinformation or the issue of communication propaganda is not specific to COVID. It will come again on other issues. And now we recently talked about Hong Kong, but Hong Kong is also an issue of competition between political systems in different way, in different shape. But I mean, there is a political dimension that is very clear here, as much as Taiwan and to some extent, even the Korean Peninsula is more and more entering the political competition frame. And more than political competition, I would talk about ideological competition. And this is important because China is not alone. Often we tend to frame, okay, so Europe is in a very strange context in a time of US-China rivalry, there is a risk of being trapped, etc. But I think the frame is more complex. There is a strong rapprochement between China and Russia on various issues. On clear conflict areas, but also on technological cooperation. There is a rapprochement, etc. And often we also argue that China, especially at the time of COVID, is less and less appealing to a growing number of countries, and its communication strategy has been backfiring. This is partly true, in particular in Europe, but it's all partly false in some other part of the world, including in sub-Saharan Africa and part of Southeast Asia. So I would agree also with Stephen that there is a need to diversify ties with Asian partners, but also the situation in Asia is very complex and is, I would say, some countries are very ambiguous positioning towards China. So everything is related in a way. It's hard to say that diversification toward Asia would help to, I would say, approach the China issue differently, because the China issue is part of the China factor, at least is part of the question for many Southeast Asian countries. So I'm moving a bit away from your question, but all to say that I even on climate change, you know, I'm not sure it's really an area of cooperation. There is, of course, some form of convergence at multilateral level on this issue in comparison with the position of Washington following the Paris Agreement withdrawal, of course. But overall, you know, once again, it's a methodological issue for China. The important path is to be a shaper of international norms, institutions, multilateral framework. So it all depends where the agreement is coming from and which institution is shaping it. If China considers that this is shaped by Western powers illegitimately, then it might not play the same game, even if on the content it might agree that there is convergence. So I think there is, even on multilateralism, we often say that both China and the EU are strong supporters of multilateralism. But several EU institutions and representatives have also said that there is divergences of meaning, and EU and China means different type of multilateralism, certainly. But also, I would say that China want to lead a multilateral reform in a way that does not necessarily, I would say, leave a strong, a significant space to EU and EU member states from a Beijing perspective.
Thank you, Alice. I think what I'd like to do is I'd very briefly like to ask Stephen to be able to respond to some of those comments, as some of them were directed directly to him. And then I would actually like to go to Maria as well with a question from the audience. So first I'll go ahead and let Stephen respond, and then I'll come to you, Maria.
Sorry, no, just to pick up on Alice's last point on multilateralism. I think we're very clear and on the record that, including Javier Borrell, has stated very clearly that we talk the same language on multilateralism, but as you, Alice, and others have said, you know, words can have different meanings according to different actors. And it's welcome, of course, that at a certain level we agree with China on the importance of the United Nations or, you know, other multilateral institutions. But we have sharp disagreements on the WTO, also with China. I mentioned earlier the disagreement with the United States, but also with China on actual practice of WTO reform, on industrial subsidies, to name one concrete thing. We disagree. And I think we are also clear that China is promoting sort of Sino-centric forms of multilateralism, which are quite different in nature from how I think traditionally we in Europe, and also traditionally with the United States, of course, traditionally with the United States, we were approaching it. So I just wanted to have that clear on the record. Was there any particular point that I left out, Ryan, that I should respond to, that you wanted me to respond to?
No, I think that's fine. And also I think it's appropriate to go to Maria as well, because she was nodding in agreement with some of your comments there. And by the way, the question from the audience actually lines up perfectly with the discussion we're having now. So Maria, one of the questions from the audience is, Hans views a multilateral approach as essential or the best way to get China to change. And he's actually wondering if we need any new institutions, US, EU institutions, for example, or tools to accomplish this multilateral approach. So sort of piggybacking off of the multilateral discussion that we're having now, perhaps you could come in on that, Maria.
Well, I think that to have enough institutions, but the case is how can we go ahead with the implementation of our agreements, and how can we finally understand how the multilateralism is working. And allow me to make a point concerning the way that the economy is working in terms of multilateralism. I mean, I'm fully against the arguments and the discussion that now is taking place in the US concerning the decoupling US-China. I think that it is not something possible, and it will finally hurt the US economy, and it will finally hurt the Western world. And I think that the most proper term and the most proper procedure in this regard is how can we start recoupling our economies with China based on a new basis. based on the principles that they are guiding multilateralism, and of course based on the agreements, because it is, for me, it is of paramount importance, the implementation of the Paris Agreement. I think it is a milestone, and it is of paramount importance, of course, that we don't have US on board, and we don't have US on board due to the decision of Trump administration. So we have to find global partners. And in this regard, we can start discussing and building upon the issues that concerning climate change and biodiversity. We have arranged, as you know, the global summit on biodiversity for climate action in China, but it has not taken place due to the coronavirus. But it is important to know that now we have a huge amount of money coming from the EU. And of course, in China, there's a huge amount of money in order to support the economies. So maybe we can join forces. We can join forces in terms of technology, of green technology. We can join forces in terms of succeeding the same goals. It is of extremely important to understand that it is a level, but it's not something between the others. It is the most important level to up at this period of time. I mean, tackling climate change and the way that we can transform our economies into green economy by the end of the day.
Thank you, Maria. And with that, I think I'd like to go to Ingrid, and then I'll go back to Ying Hong. But first, Ingrid, you actually also brought up the Paris Agreement in your initial remarks. And I'm just wondering if you could follow up on Maria's comments on how that's an area of cooperation that we could pursue with China jointly moving forward. I also wanted to ask you about how you feel about FDI, Chinese FDI in Central Eastern Europe, because presumably FDI will be a key aspect of any Green New Deal. And as Maria just mentioned, perhaps we should welcome FDI from China in this regard. But of course, this is also complicated, as sometimes we've seen with FDI in Hungary that's drawn criticism. So if you could respond to that, I think that would be very helpful. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Regarding the cooperation in the environment area, or regarding the Paris Agreement, I would say that very good level playing field could be G20. G20 framework, where we have all these players together, and actually also green agenda is the global agenda, and this could be a very good way to engage China in various sectoral policies. First of all, thinking about the measures to fight the coronavirus, thinking about the measures for recovery of economies, EU economies and global economy in general. Part of this package is the environmental agenda. Part of this package is the digital transition, migration, and so on. So why not to think about this channel to engage China more? And G20 has been becoming very important forum since the communication with the US has been more and more complicated. The G20 could play that role. Regarding the FDI in Central and Eastern Europe, maybe this is the time to mention 17+1 format. One can understand the China policy, how to manage dialogue with group of countries between Europe and Central Asia. So 17+1 format actually has been seen by Slovakia as a way to coordinate and to put together the countries from northern part of Europe to southern part of Europe. Some of these countries are members of the European Union, some are not. And somehow to package these countries into one entity to have a dialogue. And so far our experience with this format has been, how to say that, there are very mixed views within the region on this format. So far, it has been more, I would say, beauty contest. Who more cooperates? Who has more dialogue and investment with China? In this regard, Slovakia has been quite conservative country. Also, 5 million country is not so big attraction for the Chinese investment, but so far really beauty contest. And yes, I think it's a strong message in some countries for the European Union, especially in countries of Western Balkans, that okay, Chinese are present there, but that's a message for the EU to be present also, because in the end of the day, the ambition of these countries is to join a European Union, but at the same time, European Union is challenged by the Chinese investments in these countries without any conditionality, very similarly how it is going on in Africa. So yeah, so I think one has to be on one side, it is a package of for communication with this region for China, but at the same time there is quite a great degree of diverse approach to China.
Excellent.
In case of Slovakia, the last sentence, in case of Slovakia, actually we see we are part of it, but at the same time, this is not competition to the EU. EU is still, for many of these countries, the key policy framework, and it is not competition. Let's see it as more as a complementarity to the EU-China policy.
Thank you, State Secretary. So with that, I think what we'll do is we'll give each of the remaining panelists about 1 minute, 30 seconds for final remarks. I would like to actually start with Teresa on this, as I saw you nodding in agreement and also maybe disagreement with the State Secretary. So I think it'll be great to start with you. And we will go ahead and give each of the panelists, about 1 minute to 1 minute and 30 seconds to make final remarks.
Okay, I'm glad that you brought up the 17+1, because we see that China has been pursuing its strategy even during the pandemic there, with Hungary, for example, bearing this legislation for 10 years in order to build the Belgrade railway, that this is a key part of this land-sea corridor that China has envisioned for the region. And also, I think the big question for Europe is what's happening to the possible accession states. For example, Serbia. We saw President Vučić kiss the Chinese flag, meet them at the airport, and I heard from others that that plane actually was paid for by the EU funds. So Chinese equipment was on it in addition to European equipment. So the narrative is very sketchy, I would say, and I think this is a long-term issue for Europe. In addition, I just read recently that 2 days ago, Serbia and Beijing, the PRC signed an agreement on space cooperation. So I didn't know Serbia had such a deep background, but it raises Serbia up, and it's actually bringing them closer and closer to China. So I think this Balkan question, or this issue in Central and Eastern Europe, this is a huge long-term issue for Europe. And I think, as previous officials have said, we overestimated Russia and we underestimated China's influence. This issue about the multilateral approach, EU is losing influence, clearly. These positions are going to China. China has 4 of the main seats in the UN organizations. We saw what happened in Africa when a French candidate was supposed to be in charge of this UN agency. The EU with 27 member states plus possible accession states and who might support their votes, they can't get these votes. So China is winning in the multilateral sphere. So they're eroding Europe's influence. And the climate agreement, I know everyone's talking about we must cooperate with China, but there was a wonderful paper written by the Institute Montaigne, debunking all of these notions about these areas of cooperation. At the 2 sessions, China has actually increased use of coal. because for them, the most important thing is to keep the economy humming along. They don't really care about the environment when the economy is in tough shape. On the Belt and Road Initiative, I read somewhere they have built almost 300 coal-fired plants. Okay, and last thing, okay, I think one of the biggest issues that Europe has to contend with now is what their position will be on Huawei. And this is really the game changer. And will they be able to pull together and actually come up with a better strategy? Thanks.
Thank you, Teresa. I'd like to go to Alice, then Ying Hong.
Okay, I will be very brief to identify three main challenges that I see when it comes to EU-China relation. One is methodology that I mentioned. A sub one related to methodology is, I would say, the multi-layered approach of China towards Europe, including local diplomacy. More and more cities will become diplomatic actors of key significance. Why? Because China is trying to reinforce the sister city partnership to reach out to local government at city, provincial, regional level, etc. But also because from a technology viewpoint, China is trying to become a smart city global leader, trying to export technologies and norms towards a local government in this regard. Europe is not so far really concerned with this approach, but still is a target. And beyond smart city package, there is also the smart port, smart airport, smart railway challenges that can be hard to identify from a central government viewpoint, but that are ongoing. So in my last point, last challenge is technology. Teresa just mentioned 5G, but I think 5G is just the tip of the iceberg in a way, because when you look at the entity list published by the Trump administration, many other technologies are the center of a very strong tension between Beijing and Washington, as you know. AI, surveillance cameras and thermal cameras. There is also data centers. There is also, a lot of technologies that are listed here, from drones, etc. Many of them have been partly used during the COVID crisis and will increasingly be promoted outside of China, and will raise a key question in terms of positioning for EU member states and the EU. So I would broaden the questioning and the strategic challenge on Huawei. I think it's much broader, and it really calls for an ambitious European strategy in the field.
Excellent, thank you. I think, so what we'll do is we'll go to Ying Hong, then Stephen, and then Maria will have the final word. So Ying Hong, if you'd like to come in.
I thank you, question. I will respond to the multilateralism, China's position on the multilateralism. And China supports the multilateralism. I think that it's important message approach to tackle with this complicated crisis recently or in the future happened in the world, on the world. And the multilateralism is the basic principle to tackle with the complicated crisis. It's important to come together of different countries in different stage of develop period. And this is important they come together and to share their different views. So it's very, I think, maybe China and Europe has very different views on the different things because China and Europe have different on the stage of different development, and we have no common the culture or history experience. So it's I think it's normal. But the firstly important thing is that we come together. We come to on a common platform to exchange our and to discuss the detailed policy. And I think China and EU, they maybe they can reflect the very different group of the country. China maybe reflects some thinking about the developing country, and the EU can reflects the thinking of the developed country. So if both have common policy on one thing, maybe this can strengthen the whole world to tackle with detailed thing. It's very important. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ying Hong. Stephen?
Super. Two final comments from my side, hopefully under 1 minute. Here goes. I think we're entering a more competitive world, and the corona pandemic is accelerating that change. And if you enter rough seas, you got to stick together. And I want to emphasize very much the point that at the end of the day, in the European Union, we have 27 small, medium-sized countries. And unless and until people really internalize the necessity of sticking together, we're going to be lost. And I think particularly when it comes to dealing with China, behemoth, but also other great powers, incidentally, this point really needs to be internalized. And we needed a level of discipline amongst ourselves that I think would serve us very well. And that also means, by the way, investing collectively in knowledge about China. We need more of this kind of debates in different parts of Europe, where we discuss the challenges that we face and how we address them together. So that's the first point. Second point is on technology, very brief. I think Alice is absolutely right. I mean, who will set the standards on these new technologies, and what values will underpin those standards is a key question for this century. It's not only 5G, it's big data, it's on surveillance technology. Who sets the standards? Who sets the rules? Because who sets the rules will rule the world. And I hope very much that Europe will play a leading role on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. And Maria, I will go ahead and give you the last word today. You do have to unmute your microphone.
Okay, it's okay now?
Yeah, we can't see you, but we can hear you fine.
Okay, allow me to try to fix it. No, ask to start your video. Okay, maybe it's okay now?
Yep, we can see you and hear you now.
Okay, thank you once again. Thank you for the interesting exchange of view. I would like just to focus on two issues. The first one is the foreign direct investments. I would like to say that the legislation that the Union is putting forward, it will be into force by October, will be a very crucial and interesting one. But I insist that we have to take into account the specific interests from every indeed member state. And I would like to focus on the example of the port of Piraeus in Greece. We asked for the privatization of the port of Piraeus, and nobody coming from the EU or the US was interested. So it is important to know that if we finally decide to become attractive in terms of the global market and in terms of the global capital, then it is important to understand that we need maybe a more collective approach in terms of investment, especially within EU. And the second one is the question of standard setting. And I think that it is important to say that now we are in a level that the Chinese companies, and especially Huawei, is setting the standards in terms of 5G technology. And I think that we have to start accelerating, to start working in order to bridge the gap, because we are lagging behind. And I think that it's not enough for the EU to have a percentage of 30% in this regard. So I think that the most important in this debate is how can we enhance our collective approach in terms not only of how can we address the challenges that China is raising, but also how can we address the challenges that the global situation is raising for EU. Once again, thank you very much for your interesting debate, and allow me to leave because I have a meeting concerning the renovation of buildings, and I am the rapporteur on behalf of family. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, with that, I would just like to say one final remark, which is that it seems very clear to me that the question of sticking together and getting consensus is going to be quite a difficult one in the European Union. It's going to be, in fact, just as significant and difficult as perhaps the question of China pursuing its own interests. And it's very clear to me that more dialogues like this are necessary to generate this type of consensus around these issues. So I'd like to thank everyone who participated as panelists, and also everyone in the audience for joining us today. Thank you very much for sharing your views. We very much appreciate your time, and we would hopefully see you again soon in a similar format. So thanks again.